Thank you, everyone. It's certainly been quite a journey the last 2 days. In a sense, we started at one end of the spectrum, at the worst possible case scenario that could happen to vulnerable communities. They're near extermination at the hands of the Nazis. And we walked past the crematoria and the gas chambers where those acts took place. And since then, we've sort of run back the tape. We went down this morning to ask, where were the lawyers? Who could have stopped this? Who could have prevented it? And we saw the results of a failure, a broad-based failure of the legal profession in Germany to stand up at critical moments to prevent the kind of Holocaust that eventually took place. It was an abdication of their oaths as lawyers and their duties as citizens, but nonetheless, that's the reality that happened. And then we transitioned to the beginnings of doing something about it with the performance of the lawyers in the cases after the Holocaust, after World War II. And we saw the struggles of the American lawyers to honor their oaths, to prosecute war criminals, when in fact, at the end of the day, the sentences were commuted and people were let go. The struggle of American lawyers to defend Nazis when they were appointed to do so, knowing that it would jeopardize their future careers. But in those days, we see the beginnings of a trend to do something about it, and that trend continues to today. So then we transition to modes of intervention. We talked about the CIA's efforts to capture war criminals in Serbia and in Afghanistan after 9/11. And we learned about the efforts of civil lawyers to basically cabin and control the flow of money and flow of resources and keep them away from those who would profit from evil doing. And so now we're at the other end of the spectrum, and that is nothing bad has happened yet. How do you prevent it from happening in an atmosphere where there's a rising tide of intolerance and hate and increasing number of violent incidents predicated on misguided ideologies? So we started looking at this issue at Rutgers in 2015. I think I mentioned this earlier this morning. I had a sabbatical, I spent it in Paris, and we decided to look at the reality of demographic change with 1 billion people around the world living in potentially hostile environments, and to look at the original diaspora community, the Jewish communities in Europe, and how are they faring, what are their best practices after all these years of learning to ensure their safety. And so we spent a year, and I enlisted the assistance of subject matter experts, and Paul Goldenberg was one of the primary ones that I enlisted. Paul, as Russ mentioned, has a long career in fighting hate crimes, really one of the pioneers in that field for the Jewish community, not just in New Jersey, but eventually all across the nation. And Paul also worked with the OSCE in Europe, training police in hate crime detection and prosecution, and we drew upon his experience. We also had subject matter experts like Sean Griffin, who was retired as the counterterrorism coordinator for Europol, Richard Benson, who was the head of the Jewish community security apparatus in the UK, and people like that. So we assembled a team of experts, and we went to various communities around Europe and tried to distill from them what the best practices were, and frankly, what the best practices in some cases were not being observed. And we've been able to distill those lessons into some ways in which we can help vulnerable communities around the world, and we're currently working in several such locations. You hear about the work we've done in Brussels. You hear about the work it's ongoing in places in the United States like Whitefish, Montana, Malmo, Sweden, places where we think we can make a difference. Obviously, we have limited resources, as everyone does, so we have to be careful about target selection. We have more invitations to come and help than we have resources to bring to bear, but where the need is great, we know that we can find a way to assist various communities, and that's our mission. And what we've discovered in the course of our travels is that if there's one single thing that you can do as a community, a vulnerable community, it's to reach out to other vulnerable communities, identify your common interests, and try to enlist the assistance and cooperation of law enforcement. In the places where the vulnerable communities have been most successful, they've been able to show a value added to the law enforcement mission, to do joint training with them, to consult with them on the design of their facilities so that they're hardened targets and they're more difficult to penetrate. And frankly, to understand the nature of the threat changes from year to year, from day to day, and from minute to minute. And there has to be a heightened sense of vigilance among all involved in order to secure and make safe their way in the world. So with that, I think the appropriate thing for me to do is turn it over to Paul Goldenberg. Paul's going to describe the efforts that have been underway in the U.S. for the last couple decades anyway, to protect vulnerable communities, work he's been intimately involved in. I'm hoping to also touch on the work that was done by Richard Benson, who had to leave a little early today, in the UK, because I think you put the two together and you have a pretty good paradigm for how to address these issues, not necessarily the prescription for what to do, but for the almost an algorithm for how to identify the steps to take to protect vulnerable communities. So with that, Paul.